while he's doing that, let me just say thank you. It's a great honor to be on the stage with this distinguished group of individuals and to be in the wake of the very impressive speakers who came earlier today. I am Alex Winter Nelson. I'm a professor at the University of Illinois. I'm actually an agricultural economist. I do my work mostly on the impacts of technology and policy on poverty and food security. But for about the last year, I've been director of the ADM Institute for the Prevention of Post-Harvest Loss. And so what I want to talk with you today about is these issues around post-harvest loss, in particular the scale of it, the sources of it, and some of the things that we are doing to do something about it. All right. So this institute, the ADM Institute for Prevention of Post-Harvest Loss, ADMI as we call it, exists as an international hub for evaluating, creating, and disseminating technologies, practices, also systems that might involve enabling environments or policies that reduce post-harvest loss in commodities, particularly in major cereals and oilseeds. We were established with a gift from ADM Corporation in 2011. That gift was made to the University of Illinois, and it's now based in the College of Agricultural, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences there at the university. So I want to make completely clear, I don't represent ADM Corporation. But I think that the Institute reflects some of the priorities and values of ADM. So why does this ADMI exist? Why worry about post-harvest loss? Globally, according to the FAO, 1/3 of food that's produced is lost or wasted. That's 1.3 billion tons per year. That's a lot. Each year, that's more than enough to feed all the people who are undernourished in the world. In fact, it could feed 37 million people for life. 1 year of the food that's lost and wasted could feed 37 million people for 70 years. So there's a food security argument for caring about it. There's also an environmental argument that wasted and lost food accounts for 1/12 of all greenhouse gas emissions. If you accept that 30% of the food that we produce is lost, and that agriculture accounts for 25% of greenhouse gases, as the IPCC said, then 1/12 of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from wasted food. Some of the World Bank likes to say that if post-harvest loss were a country, it'd be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases. I'm not sure if that quite makes sense, but it's a statistic. You can extend that to resources broadly. So the amount of land that's devoted to food that's ultimately wasted, the amount of water that's devoted to food that's ultimately wasted, implies that this post-harvest loss is a drag on our environment. 198 million hectares are used to produce food that's lost. That's Mexico, like throwing it away every year. And when I speak of loss, I'm talking about quantity loss. I'm also talking about deterioration in quality. So grain that's lost due to mycotoxins in terms of its quality, or that suffers nutrient degradation or seed viability loss. All right, so why care about post-harvest loss? Well, the post-harvest loss reduces food availability in the world, and so contributes to food insecurity at a time when 1 in 9 people are food insecure. Post-harvest loss lowers incomes for smallholder farmers. Right? $4 billion worth of grain is lost in sub-Saharan Africa every year, a country where there's an awful lot of extreme poverty. How could we capture that for people? And the waste of resources that's implied by post-harvest loss means that we could make a lot of progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions if we made progress towards reducing post-harvest losses. Or at least we could reduce the carbon intensity of the food that we produce, right, if we didn't throw away as much food. So the idea is that it might be easier to avoid loss than to produce more food at reduced greenhouse gases per calories. All right. It turns out that reduction of post-harvest loss is very much consistent with the sustainability goals of ADM. So this image I'm showing here is from the last corporate sustainability report for ADM, and I show this just to highlight the consistency, the alignment. The number one material concern for ADM in terms of its sustainability efforts is greenhouse gas emissions and resource conservation. All right. So reduce post-harvest loss, we're automatically improving the footprint of agriculture per unit produced, or actually consumed, I should say, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of land, in terms of water, in terms of energy. Another set of concerns for ADM sustainability is human rights and labor conditions, and food safety and consumer safety. All right, so addressing mycotoxin and aflatoxin in Africa is a consumer safety issue. It's a post-harvest loss issue. If addressing post-harvest loss helps us to ensure food security for farmers in particular, or the safety of food that farmers are consuming, then we've addressed a human rights and labor concern. And another set of material concerns for ADM is supply chain management and technology and innovation, encouraging better supply chains, encouraging enhanced innovation to address agricultural systems and food systems. That's how we address post-harvest loss, by having better marketing systems, by having better supply chains, and through innovations. Okay. Now, why cereals? I think when a lot of us think about food waste, at least I think of the cilantro rotting in the back of my fridge. I think of high-value horticulture crops that get thrown away. But in terms of calories lost, cereals account for the largest share. 53% of lost calories post-harvest is in cereals, simply because cereals are so much of what we produce. About 30% of cereals lost in Africa. Oilseeds, another significant amount. So a higher share of roots and tubers that are produced, a higher share of horticultural products that are produced are lost, but in terms of total calories lost, cereals account for the most. We focus on developing countries, and that's because at every step of the chain from harvest on, harvest, threshing, drying, storage, there are opportunities for increased efficiency in developing countries. And likewise, there's local capacity failures. There's inadequate capacity for making the investments or doing the research to address those problems at each stage post-harvest. And that's very different from developed countries. You saw something similar to this diagram already. The point here is that, if I've got the right one, in developed countries, North America, industrialized Asia, Europe, most post-harvest loss is happening at the consumer level. Right? We have fairly efficient production and post-harvest distribution systems, so the loss occurs after retail. But if you move down to lower and lower income countries, as in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, where ADMI is working, most of the loss is farm or storage or the marketing, and very little occurs at retail or post-retail. Right, now I want to show you a few slides just to put an image in mind, so you can see just how this kind of post-harvest loss is emerging, because these losses come from some very specific conditions in the fields and in the markets in Africa and in South Asia. Okay, so it starts with harvest loss. And this is an image, a picture I took in Bangladesh this last December. And what you see there is a lot of rice that's been cut and is sitting in the field that's very wet. And it has all been very carefully laid on top of the stubble to try to keep it dry. Until somebody can come along and collect it for threshing. Right? So this obviously is not a great practice, right? To have rice sitting in a wet field. At one level, this is a reflection of breeders' success. Okay. Erie and other institutions have done such great work in increasing rice yields in Bangladesh that you've sometimes got 3 harvests going on in a year. There is no absorptive capacity for all that rice. Right? There's not enough threshers. There's not enough room to dry it. And so it sits in the field, and success in breeding has actually increased the problem post-harvest, or has pushed us into this post-harvest bottleneck. Another problem is climate change. Right? If it's raining when you don't expect it, it's a lot harder to keep your grain dry. And so harvest loss. Next, you go to thresh it. Right? And here's the technology. A guy whacking a stone with the rice. He's very good at it. In fact, this guy only does the highest quality rice, and he does it because they want to minimize the loss. But probably not everybody is as good at it, right? And there are very popular machine threshers, but there's a shortage, which is why that other rice was sitting in the field. There's a lot of exposure going on here. There's a lot of high cost, right? A specialist's time is costly. Then we move to cleaning and winnowing. Mostly women's work in Bangladesh, and in most of the world, this kind of post-harvest activity falls heavily onto women. You can see this is in the open air. It's exposed to a lot of potential contaminants. There's a lot of potential for damage. People are walking on it. Animals are walking on it. There's a heavy labor burden. And that burden, as I said, falls very heavily on women, which can lead to some overload and some other problems. Most of the grain in the developing world is then sun-dried, laid out in the open air for drying, where it's exposed to lots of threats, like those chickens. Right now, the farmer whose home I was photographing here felt very strongly that what those hens ate was not wasted, right? And it wasn't. But I think we can think of probably more selective ways to produce your poultry feed. There's exposure to lots of other contaminants, including contaminants from those chickens. There's a high labor burden here, and it turns out to be a growing labor burden because as rains come more and more unexpectedly, that rice, or whatever it happens to be, has to get rolled up, covered up, and pulled out of the way throughout the day. Again, that becomes a gender issue because that's usually women's work, because men are often off doing other things. So the post-harvest loss problem or challenge has been intensified, I'd say, by increased production, which is good news, and by climate change. Then we move to storage. Now, it's important to note that around the world, in low-income countries of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, most grain is going to be stored on-farm for some time. Most drying is going to take place on-farm, and the grain is then going to be stored either for home consumption or for sale later. So about 1/3 of the grain is going to be sold immediately to deal with liquidity problems. About 1/3 of it is going to be sold later on in the year. The farmer's waiting for prices to rise, if he or she can. And then about 1/3 consumed on farm. That's a gross inaccuracy. It's wrong everywhere, but it's kind of right in general from 30,000 feet. And you can see the storage technologies are pretty rudimentary. They tend to be porous, like this basket, so they're letting in a lot of moisture. If you did manage to dry your grain before you put it in there, it's not going to stay dry. The monsoons will come in Bangladesh, humidity will rise, and your grain will become wetter. It's open so you can get access to rodents, like that little guy right there. And in many cases, it's just laying in the guy's bedroom, okay? That's the bed, that's the rice. And the farmer I talked to about this said his only complaint about that was all the insects it brought into the house. So there's a lot of loss in there. Here's an image from Myanmar from a few years earlier. I like this image because you can see all the stages there. There's the maize in the husk maize, and then maize that's been threshed a bit. That happens to be a highway on-ramp that's used for drying seasonally. So there's real shortages in infrastructure, private and public, for these kind of functions. All right. I want to talk a little bit more about Bangladesh, just because that's a place where my institute has been active. And when we look at just exactly where the losses are occurring in Bangladesh, and this is for rice, wheat, and maize, it's primarily in drying and storage. Okay. There are losses in the threshing, there's losses in transportation, but the bulk of the losses, more than half of them across those crops, occurs through drying or during storage, and many of those losses during storage are because of problems during drying. Right? You didn't adequately dry the grain, and so you've got a molding problem. So, looking a little bit closer at that, these are some data from household surveys in Bangladesh, where with partners at the Bangladesh Ag University, we simply sampled farmers' grain that was stored in different storage technologies. And what you can see here is the range of moisture content from 44 out of 200 samples that were at 10 to 12%, on to 30 samples that were over 20% moisture content. About 27% of the samples had a moisture content of over 16%, which is really unacceptable. If you look at the kinds of problems that correspond to that increasing moisture content, mold jumps right out, with 18% of the grains moldy at that highest level of moisture. And this is for rice, which is not all that susceptible to aflatoxins, to mycotoxins, to molds. When we did this in India and Bihar with maize, we found that it was more like 40 or 50% of the corn aflatoxin infected at above 20 parts per billion. Insect populations likewise are higher. Not that the moisture brings in the insects, but that being permeable to water is also permeable to other kinds of pests and creates a healthy environment for pests. One overall measure of grain quality is just germination. Not that we want farmers saving all their own seed, but if the seed will germinate, you know it's pretty high quality grain. At the low moisture content, seed is at high quality, almost all of it will germinate. At the high moisture contents, less than 40% germinates. So tackling the problem is about tackling drying and storage. And what we found is that three very old technologies, these are not innovations, three very old technologies put together in one system can go a long way to addressing post-harvest loss in low-income settings. And the first one is a low-cost moisture meter. And that moisture meter in the image there was developed by an ARS scientist in Kansas. It's a very simple, low-cost, easy-to-use meter. You stick the probe in the grain. The readout gives you the moisture content for a range of grains. It costs about $60 to produce that, which makes it affordable. It is incredibly useful. It turns out most farmers are pretty good at judging moisture content by whatever rule of thumb they have, pinching it between their fingers, biting it, whatever. But it's hard to convince a buyer that your assessment is better than hers or his assessment, right? So the moisture meter resolves that difficulty. It helps resolve disputes, and it improves the management. I'm very happy to say that this has become an entrepreneurial endeavor. So the gentleman at the right there is a young man in Ghana who's launched CC Industries, manufacturing and selling these moisture meters. The second part of this system is simply having low-cost, small-scale grain dryers. And what you see in that image there is the STR dryer, which means in Vietnamese, low-cost dryer. This is modified by our colleagues at Bangladesh Ag University. That gentleman in the jacket there is Dr. Shayan Saha, who developed a version of this for use in Bangladesh. It uses primarily locally available inputs. It burns fuel that could be any farm waste or charcoal briquettes. In Bangladesh, it's usually rice husk briquettes that are used. That device costs about $500 to manufacture. It'll dry a half a ton of rice in about 4 or 5 hours, depending on the initial moisture content. It turns out to be cheaper than sun drying if you value the labor time that goes into sun drying. If that labor is free, then obviously it's not cheaper. I was very suspicious that anybody in Bangladesh, any man in Bangladesh, would buy one of these, because he probably doesn't value his wife's time that she spends drying the maize, or drying the rice rather. So I asked about that. I asked a number of male farmers in Bangladesh why they would buy this, because they were insisting they wanted one. And they said, for domestic tranquility, because when they come home, they want dinner made. And the excuse is always, I had to bring the rice in. I don't know. It seemed credible. It seemed self-centered enough to be credible to me. And it reduces post-harvest loss. The third step of the technology system is having small-scale hermetic storage, having some way for farmers on farm, since most of the grain is going to be stored on farm, to keep their cereal in an airtight and watertight container. And that is generally a 50 kg bag like that Grain Pro bag you see there. And there's a number of these on the market now. I can't claim to have invented them. The Purdue Improved Cowpea bag was the first one, the PICS bag. All of them are hermetically sealable. They'll therefore maintain the moisture content at whatever dryness it went in at. And they can, in fact, eliminate insect infestation. So that diagram at the bottom there is showing you increasing moisture content over a period of 75 days with various traditional storage systems versus the hermetically sealed bag, which keeps the moisture content steady. Kinds of things that translates into are lower insect infestation, lower weight loss, fewer damaged grains, and improved germination in the end. The key here is that all those three of those things have to be done together, right? To put wet maize in a hermetically sealed bag is not particularly useful. To have dried maize in an open floor is not particularly useful. Combining those things together has the impact. So the question with these technologies being as simple as they are is, to me, why does the problem persist? Because none of those things I showed you are particularly new. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is you have to do multiple practices together. And low-income farmers in low-income countries generally adopt things incrementally. So if you're not ready to get in for the dryer and you just get the hermetically sealed bag, you might find it not very useful and drop it. Right? Vice versa with the dryer and out the bag. There's also a problem of low awareness. Very few farmers in the developing countries that we've worked are particularly aware that they are losing grain, or they think it's normal. That's most true with quality loss. A survey, again, in Bihar State in India, we found that fewer than 2% of farmers had any idea that they ever had aflatoxin or any kind of mold on their corn. When we tested it, 40% of the samples were above 20 parts per billion were unhealthy to eat. There's limited awareness of solutions because of extension issues around the world being as weak as they are. And finally, there's fairly poor incentives to actually produce higher quality grain. Okay? So very few farmers that I've shown you pictures of will see a premium in the market or any market for improved quality. So why would they invest in it if they can't get their money for it? And that is our next step, moving towards an app. So what you see here in the upper left-hand corner is something that's somewhat new. It's an in-the-bag remote sensor that will sense moisture content, oxygen, carbon dioxide, temperature, and then transmit the information either via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to the smartphone or any other kind of central hub that you would want. And the idea is that with that, a farmer can know the state of his or her grain, but equally important, a trader somewhere else can know the state of grain in a situation that might be remote. So if your grain is in a warehouse in a remote area, the trader will not go there. It's costly to go there, especially when he gets there and discovers the rice is gone and the corn is moldy. But if you have this kind of information available and transparent, then we hope we can incentivize traders to go, inform farmers to know what their grain is worth, because you could, on that same app, have price information, and hopefully stimulate improved management practices, or at least create an incentive to have them. All right, so prospects. I hope I've convinced you that post-harvest loss is a problem. It's at a scale that it's worth addressing, and addressing it has the potential to really move the needle on food insecurity, to enhance smallholder incomes, and to improve our environmental management from the agricultural sector. We have known technologies. Most of them need some adaptation. Right? So the dryer that works in Manitoba might not work in Bangladesh. In Africa where it rains less, or in parts of Africa where it rains less and it's more sunny, a solar bubble dryer makes a lot more sense than the STR dryer. But the technologies are there and are close enough that it doesn't take much adaptation to make them work. New innovations using information technology might be what it takes to create the market and create the systems to actually see those technologies adopted. And that's where we hope to be moving. And with that, I'll...